I followed the footsteps. Then, they followed me. The first tracks appeared on the third morning. I made the mistake of following them. By sunset, I realized the tracks were no longer leading away from me. They were leading toward me. I'm 48 years old. I've hunted the backcountry of western Montana for over 25 years. And I want to say plainly, before I tell you anything else, that I am not a man who frightens easily, and I am not a man who goes looking for stranger explanations than the ones already sitting in front of me. If a track in the mud has an explanation, I want the boring one. I've spent a career finding it. I didn't find it this time. I've spent 3 years trying. What I'm going to tell you happened over the course of 6 days, alone, in a remote drainage I'd hunted maybe half a dozen times before. I want to walk you through it in the order it happened, because the order is the only thing that makes the strangest part of it make any sense at all. If I told you how it ended first, you'd dismiss it in about 4 seconds. I need you to live through the days the way I lived through them, including the part where I genuinely believed, for 2 full days, that I understood exactly what was happening to me. I was wrong about that for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. The story I want to tell you isn't really about tracks at all. It's about exactly when the watcher and the watched traded places, and how long it took me to notice. So let's start at the beginning, because the beginning still felt completely ordinary. The first 2 days. This happened 3 years ago, in late September, on a solo elk hunt into a stretch of the Bitterroot backcountry I knew reasonably well. I filed my route with the ranger station, the way I always do, and told my wife exactly when to start worrying if she didn't hear from me. 6 days alone, with a full kit and more food than I'd strictly need. I left my truck before first light and hiked 7 miles in before setting up base camp near a creek I'd used before. The first 2 days were exactly what I'd hoped for. Good weather, fresh elk sign, the kind of quiet, productive scouting that makes up most of any honest hunting trip. I didn't realize it at the time, but the thing that changed the entire trip had already happened before I ever saw the first print. I just hadn't found it yet. On the morning of the 3rd day, I found something that didn't belong. The first track I'd left camp before light to check a stand of timber I'd scouted the evening before, working along a game trail that paralleled the creek for most of its length. About a 1/4 mile out, in a patch of damp soil near a small spring, I came across a track that stopped me in my boots. Large, bipedal. The weight distribution and toe positioning didn't match any 4-legged animal I knew how to read in that kind of substrate. And I've tracked elk, deer, moose, and bear in that exact range for over 2 decades. This didn't match any of them. I crouched there a long moment, the way you do when something refuses to fit everything you thought you understood about a piece of ground. The print was isolated, clean-edged, nothing crossing or smearing it, in a spot that should have held a confusing tangle of overlapping animal sign, given how many species use a spring like that on any ordinary week. My first assumption, the only reasonable one available to me, was a bear walking briefly on its hind legs, the way they sometimes do when investigating something at height. I held on to that explanation for most of the morning, mostly because it was the only one that didn't require me to take the find more seriously than I wanted to. I photographed it, measured it against my own boot, and made a decision I've turned over in my mind More times than any other decision of that entire trip, I decided to follow it. It never once occurred to me that morning that I might already be the one being followed. Why I followed it? I want to explain that decision honestly, because it's the part of this story other experienced hunters will understand immediately, and the part everyone else finds hardest to forgive me for. 25 years in that backcountry teaches you that unexplained sign is rare, and rare sign is the kind of thing a serious hunter doesn't simply walk past. I told myself I was tracking an animal, using exactly the same skills, exactly the same patience I'd used thousands of times before. I'd followed strange sign plenty of times, and it had always resolved into something explainable, an animal I hadn't expected, a track distorted by mud, a story for a campfire with no real weight attached to it. I didn't consider, not even once that first day, that the thing being tracked and the thing doing the tracking might not be the roles I assumed they were. The track led generally northwest, away from my camp, through mixed timber and across two more patches of exposed ground that held partial prints, clearly enough to confirm I was following the same thing, moving in a continuous, deliberate line, rather than the wandering path you'd expect from an animal simply foraging. By mid-afternoon, I'd covered nearly 2 miles from camp, further than I'd planned, and I made the call to turn back rather than risk being caught out after dark in terrain I was quickly losing my bearing on. That night, for the first time, I heard something I couldn't explain. The first night, it started a couple hours after dark. Heavy, deliberate movement somewhere beyond the reach of my fire, with long pauses between each sound, the kind of pacing that told me whatever was making, it wasn't in any hurry, and wasn't especially concerned about being heard. I've spent enough nights alone in that kind of country to know the ordinary catalog of sounds, and this wasn't any of them. I called out. Nothing answered. The movement stopped, resumed once farther off, then went quiet entirely. I sat up a long while after that, telling myself it was a bear, the same explanation I'd been telling myself all day. I want to be honest that the explanation felt thinner that night than it had that morning, though I couldn't have told you exactly why at the time. I fed my fire more than it needed, the way you do when a fire feels like the only honest defense you have against something you can't quite name. What I didn't know yet was that the track I'd followed that day was only the beginning of a pattern that was about to get a great deal stranger. I'd spend the next 2 days reading every sign of it correctly and understanding none of what it actually meant. The second track. The next morning, my 4th day in that drainage, I went looking for the track again, partly out of genuine curiosity, and partly because some part of me needed to know whether what I'd found the day before had been some kind of fluke. It wasn't. About a half-mile from where I'd turned back the previous afternoon, I found a second track. Same proportions, same depth, continuing in roughly the same northwest direction I'd already been following. I want to be precise about something here, because it matters for everything that comes later. This print was fresher than I expected, laid down sometime in the previous 12 hours, which meant whatever made it had continued moving through that exact stretch of country well after I'd turned back the day before. I followed it for most of that day, the same way I had the first one, photographing and measuring every clear print I found along the way. The line of travel was consistent, deliberate, the kind of movement you'd expect from something with a destination in mind, not an animal simply wandering in search of food. I crossed 2 more small clearings that day, each one holding a clear enough a print to keep me certain I was following a single line rather than crisscrossing sign from multiple unrelated animals. I remember feeling, somewhere in the middle of that second day, a kind of professional satisfaction at how cleanly the line was holding together. I had no idea yet that the cleanliness of it was the first real clue. By late afternoon, the line of tracks did something I genuinely did not expect. It turned. Looking back, that was the last moment I still believed I was the one in control of the situation. The turn. I want to walk you through this moment carefully, because it's the detail that changed how I understood everything that had happened up to that point, and everything that was about to happen after it. The tracks, which had been moving in a consistent northwest line for nearly 3 miles across 2 days, curved sharply to the east, doubling back along a rough parallel course to the route I myself had taken to follow them. I stood there a long time, working through what that actually meant. An animal doesn't typically reverse its own direction of travel, that precisely unless something specific has changed, a water source, a threat, a destination reached. I checked the terrain ahead for any obvious explanation. I found nothing that would account for a deliberate course change at that exact point. No obstacle. No water. Nothing that would naturally redirect an animal's path. I traced the new direction on my own map, comparing it against the line I'd already followed, and the angle of that turn sat at almost exactly the bearing back toward my own camp. I want to tell you that I noticed, at the time, the uncomfortable possibility that the only variable that had actually changed in that landscape was my own position relative to it. I didn't let myself fully think that thought yet. I had a long way to go before I was ready to. I remember standing at that turning point for several minutes, longer than the moment actually required, the way you do when some part of you is bargaining for more time before accepting a conclusion you've already reached. I told myself a dozen mundane explanations in those minutes. A water source I hadn't noticed, a competing animal, simple chance. None of them held up against the precision of that angle for longer than it took me to say them out loud to myself. I kept walking anyway. 2 more days of walking before I let myself finish that thought. The second night that night, the sounds returned, and this time they were different in a way I noticed immediately. The movement was no longer distant. It was closer, circling rather than approaching from a single direction, moving from one side of my camp to the other over the course of nearly an hour, never closing the distance fully, but never retreating to the range it had kept the night before either. I want to be honest about what that did to me, because I think the honesty matters more than any false bravado would. I did not sleep that second night. I sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, listening to something move around the edges of my firelight without ever once stepping into it. I tried, the way you do when fear competes with curiosity, to track its position relative to specific landmarks I could see, a dead snag, a break in the timber. And every time, the picture that emerged was the same. Close, patient, never quite committing to anything I'd recognize as an approach. I didn't know it yet, but that patience was the whole story. I just hadn't found the shape of it. At one point, well past midnight, I heard a sound I still haven't been able to categorize. Not quite a vocalization, not quite simple movement, something in between, brief and low, that raised the hair on my arms in a way nothing else in that backcountry ever had. I told myself, lying there, that I would head home a day early. I did not yet understand that going home a day early was not going to be as simple as I assumed. The camp disturbance. I want to tell you about something I found the following morning, because it's the detail that finally broke through whatever remaining confidence I had in the bare explanation entirely. My food bag, which I'd hung the night before, using a proper counterbalance method, roughly 200 yards from camp, had been disturbed. Not destroyed, not torn apart the way a bear would handle it, looking for whatever was inside through brute force. Lowered. The rope had been worked loose from the branch it was secured over and set down, gently on the ground beneath it. The bag itself untouched, unopened, sitting upright rather than thrown or dragged. I stood there a long time, the way you do when evidence in front of you refuses to fit any category you already have available. An animal solving a counterbalance system and then declining to actually eat the food once it succeeded is not behavior I had any prior experience to draw on. Bears that work hard enough to get into food typically eat the food. This had been lowered, inspected, and left exactly as it was, aside from being on the ground rather than hanging from a branch. I checked the ground around that bag carefully, the same inch-by-inch search I'd used to document any unusual sign, and found no clear tracks there at all, despite soft enough soil that anything heavy crossing it should have left some trace. I sat with that absence longer than I sat with almost anything else from that trip. A bear leaves chaos and a clear trail. Whatever had done this left neither. It had solved a problem, decided against the obvious reward waiting on the other side of it, and departed without leaving the kind of physical record that should have accompanied either action. I want you to remember that detail, because it's going to matter again before this story is over. The third day of tracking. I made the decision that morning, against every piece of good judgment 25 years of experience should have given me, to track the second set of prints one more time, specifically to follow the eastward turn and see exactly where it led. Part of it was stubbornness, the kind that comes from being the most experienced person in any room I usually find myself in, and the discomfort of facing something that didn't fit my own expertise. Part of it was a need to disprove the thought I'd had the day before, the one about my own position being the variable that had changed. I told myself, hiking out that morning, that I'd find a clean, professional explanation by the end of the day, the way I always had on every other strange trip in 25 years. I followed that eastward line for nearly 4 hours, through terrain that grew progressively more difficult, until the tracks led me to a small clearing I didn't recognize, ringed by mature timber, with disturbed ground in patches that didn't match any bedding pattern I knew how to read. The quiet there struck me before I found anything specific, the kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty so much as held. I found a partial print there, the clearest one yet, close enough that I could finally see, without ambiguity, exactly what kind of gait had made it. I stood looking at it for a long moment before I let myself reach for my map. And that's when I understood exactly how close that line of tracks had actually brought me to my own camp. the realization. I want to be precise about the geography here, because it's the single most important detail in this entire account. I checked my map and my compass, the way you do when something about your own position has started to feel less certain than it should. I checked it again, then a third time. I sat down on a fallen log and worked through the math, certain I'd made an error somewhere, hoping I had. I hadn't. The clearing I was standing in sat almost exactly 2 miles southeast of my own camp. The first track had led me northwest. The second had turned east. Together, they formed a circle, and my camp sat near the center of it. I had spent 2 full days believing I was the one gathering information. 2 full days believing I understood, better than anything I was tracking, exactly what was happening in that drainage. I wasn't tracking it. It had been tracking me. I sat there a long time after that, longer than the moment strictly required, watching the light change across that clearing. I'd built a career on being the most careful, most observant person in any stretch of backcountry I walked into. For 2 full days in this exact drainage, that simply hadn't been true. The walk back. I want to tell you honestly what the walk back to camp felt like, because it's the part of this story most people who haven't experienced something similar struggle to understand. It wasn't panic, not in the dramatic sense people imagine. It was something quieter and, in its own way, worse. The disorienting realization that the entire framework I'd been using to understand my situation for 2 days had been backward the whole time. I had believed I was the one doing the tracking. I now understood I might have been the one being tracked from the very beginning, and that everything I'd interpreted as an animal's movement had actually been the movement of something, keeping a deliberate, careful distance from me, while I focused entirely on a trail of evidence in front of me, rather than anything that might be behind me. Every step back toward camp, I found myself running the same math again. Northwest, then east, then a circle. A circle I'd walked the outer edge of for 2 days without once understanding what I was actually walking. I moved quickly back toward camp, faster than the terrain really allowed for safely, checking behind me more times than I could count, hearing nothing, seeing nothing, and somehow finding that absence more unsettling than any sound would have been. I want to be honest that I considered, more than once during that hour, simply continuing east past my own camp entirely and walking straight out of that drainage without stopping. I didn't. 25 years of training won out over that impulse, the same training that had told me, 2 days earlier, that following an unexplained track was a reasonable, professional decision. I reached camp a little before dark. What I found there is the moment this story stopped being about tracks I was following and became something else entirely. What was waiting at camp? I want to describe this as plainly as I can, because plain description is the only thing that does this moment justice. My tent had not been touched. My gear was exactly where I'd left it. Nothing had been damaged, disturbed, or stolen in any way I could identify in the failing light. But in the soft dirt at the edge of my fire ring, in a spot I had walked across and stood beside dozens of times over the previous 4 days, there was a fresh track. Bipedal. Same proportions as every other print I'd documented over the previous 2 days. It was facing my tent. I stood there a long moment before I let myself move any closer. The soil around it was still damp at the edges, the kind of damp that doesn't hold for more than a few hours once the day's heat sets in. It overlapped none of my own prints from earlier that morning. Whatever left it had done so recently. Recently enough that I had to ask myself, standing there in the last of the light, whether it had still been at my camp when I'd finally turned back to start the walk home. I crouched down beside it the way you do when you need to confirm with your own hands that something is real and not simply a trick of fading light. I ran my fingers along the edge of it. It was real. Sharp-edged enough that I knew, without any doubt at all, that it hadn't been there that morning. It had been here. While I was 2 miles away, certain I was the one gathering information. While I sat on that fallen log working out a circle on a map, something had already closed the distance and stood exactly where I now knelt, close enough to touch the fabric of my own tent. I was occupied entirely with a trail of evidence pointing in every direction except the one that actually mattered. It was no longer leading away from me. It was right where I was standing. The final night, I did not sleep. I built my fire as large as I safely could and waited. The sounds came back within an hour of full dark, closer than they had ever been, moving along a tightening perimeter around my camp, never directly approaching the firelight, circling at a distance that grew incrementally shorter as the night went on. Closer. Closer again. At some point, well past midnight, the sound stopped entirely, all at once. And in that silence, for one brief moment, I saw something at the very edge of my firelight. The shape. At the edge of the light it was upright, tall enough that the proportions read as wrong for anything I'd ever encountered in that backcountry. It stood at the very edge of where my firelight gave way to full dark, still for no more than 3 or 4 seconds, before stepping backward, unhurried, into the timber. I did not see a face. Everything happened too quickly, in poor enough light, for me to claim it as anything more than what I actually experienced. It did not run from me. It simply stopped being there. The rest of that night, I sat with my rifle across my lap for the remaining hours until dawn, and I want to tell you honestly that nothing else happened. No further sounds, no further sign. Just the ordinary, exhausting work of staying awake and staying alert until first light finally arrived. I broke camp the moment I had enough visibility to do it safely, and I did not look back, in any sense of that phrase, until I was well clear of that drainage entirely. I want to tell you that the hike out was uneventful, and in the narrow sense that nothing else happened, it was. But I carried an awareness on that hike I'd never carried on any hike before in my life, checking the tree line behind me more times than I could count, the entire 7 miles back to my truck. The report I called the same ranger station I'd filed my route with that evening. The ranger documented everything carefully, the tracks, the camp disturbance, the sounds, the brief sighting, without offering me any confident explanation. He told me my report wasn't the first one he'd taken describing tracks, circling a camp in that general drainage, though he wouldn't characterize what those other reports had concluded. He told me, honestly, that nothing had ever been confirmed, and that he didn't expect anything ever would be. I didn't push him for more. I've regretted that since. The evidence I kept. I photographed every clear print I found from multiple angles, with my own boot included for scale. I shared those photographs with a wildlife biologist I knew through a mutual friend. He examined them carefully and told me, honestly, that he could not confidently attribute the prints to any known species in that ecosystem, and that photographs alone, without a verified plaster cast, don't meet any reasonable scientific standard of proof. I want to honor that caution. I'm not a biologist. I'm an experienced hunter with 25 years of field credibility, and 6 days I still can't fully explain. The detail. I found a year later, I want to tell you about something I didn't discover until almost a full year after that trip, because it's the detail that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from those 6 days. Going back through my own photographs during a quiet evening the following autumn, comparing the timestamps against my own memory of when and where I'd taken each one, I noticed something I hadn't caught at the time. The print I'd found at the edge of my own fire ring, the one facing my tent, had a subtle but measurable difference from every other print I'd documented over the previous 2 days. A slightly different depth on the leading edge of the foot, the kind of variation you'd expect from an animal favoring one side slightly, the way a limp or an old injury might show up consistently across a single individual's tracks. I sat with that for a long while before I let myself follow the thought any further, because I already knew, on some level, exactly where it was going to lead. I went back through my earlier photographs that same evening, comparing that detail against the prints from the first and second day of tracking, laying the images side by side on my own kitchen table, the way I imagine an investigator would. The same subtle asymmetry was there in every single print I had documented, from the very first track 3 miles away to the one standing at the edge of my own fire. It had been the same individual the entire time. Why this matters. 2 days of tracks, spread across nearly 6 miles of difficult terrain, tracing a deliberate loop around my own camp, all made by a single, consistent individual, rather than several different animals or a series of unrelated coincidences. It wasn't several bears. It wasn't a string of unrelated encounters. It was one continuous presence, moving with intention for at least 2 full days, around a man who believed for most of that time that he was the one doing the tracking. It's the one piece of physical evidence I have that ties the entire 6 days into a single continuous account, rather than a collection of separate, more easily dismissed coincidences. Why I'm telling you this now. It's possible an unusually large bear, walking with a consistent limp from some old injury, produced every print I documented. It's possible my own perception of being tracked was shaped by exhaustion and isolation. It's possible the brief shape I saw at the edge of my firelight was nothing more than poor light and 3 sleepless nights. But I also know that I personally tracked a single, consistent set of prints across nearly 6 miles of terrain that formed a deliberate loop around my own camp. I know my food was lowered and inspected rather than destroyed, in a way that doesn't match any animal behavior I've encountered in 25 years. I know a wildlife biologist couldn't identify the species, and I know a ranger told me my account wasn't the first of its kind from that exact drainage. None of those facts, on their own, prove anything. Together, they're the reason this story has never fully left me. What's changed since I still hunt that general range? I haven't been back to that exact drainage, and I probably won't. I track differently now. I find myself checking behind me on a trail far more often than I used to. I've caught myself, more than once, asking whether a track I'm looking at is leading somewhere, or simply leading me. For 2 days, I thought I was following a trail. 3 years later, the thing I remember most isn't the track. It's the realization that the trail was never the point. I was. I still don't know what was moving through that drainage with me. I still think about that food bag more than almost anything else from those 6 days. Something that solved a problem it didn't need to solve, and set everything back down exactly as it found it. I only know that for 2 full days, while I believed I was the one watching, something else had already decided how closely it was willing to let me see. I've never been able to shake the feeling that it could have let me see more. It simply chose not to.